Hiya lads, how's it going? I was just going to ask you, what made you take up a job in the Dublin Fire Brigade yourself?
I suppose, well, it was back in the 80s. There's a couple of different reasons. One, it was back in 1985 when jobs were scarce, and a job with, the permanent pensionable job had a great attraction to it. But I had, as a young fella, had a bit of a graw for the fire brigade, and it had crossed my mind at a fairly early age that it was a job I'd like to do. I always remember back in the 60s, I lived in Ballyfermot, Kylemore Road, and just across the railway bridge from where we lived, there was factories there. There was a plastics factory which went on fire back around 67, 68. And I remember just these massive plumes of black smoke going up all day, probably poisoning the half of that area of Dublin. But people were going up to look, but my mother was saying, no, when your dad comes home from work, he'll bring you up to have a look. So I looked at my dad, I would have been 7 or 8 at the time. I just remember seeing this place blazing, these, as I say, masses of rolling black clouds coming out from all that plastic. And the guys there, the old fire engines with the big wheels on the back from the wheeled escapes, the ground looked like a plate of spaghetti with the hose going everywhere. And the guys in those days would have been in the all black helmets and the long black slickers and the rest of it. And I just remember looking at that and saying, imagine getting paid to do that. That's a job, Later years, I drifted away from the idea and just took jobs as they came up. And again, it was the 80s. You'd been in a job for a couple of years, made redundant, get another job 2 years down the line, you're made redundant. Been through that a few times, and the fire brigade came. I actually ended up working for a company who built and maintained fire brigades for Dublin Fire Brigade and other brigades around the country down in Kilmainham. And the job came up, and 3 of us in the place applied and went in over the next year. So that was my start into it.
It would have been relatively tough to get in there, like the qualifications needed, or as I always heard, it's nearly like a closed shop in some ways, like a difficult.
Not so much a closed shop, but definitely there was always a lot of applications, a huge number of applications, and there was a long drawn out process between medicals and written exams and interviews and everything else. I came in on the aftermath of the Stardust, and part of the aftermath of the Stardust was a reorganisation of Dublin Fire Brigade, and new stations opened. The outer ring of stations began to open, the Tala, Nutgrove and Blanchardstown. And so there was a need for more firemen than they'd had, or more firefighters, I should say, than they'd had in the previous 10 years, because they weren't just replacing anymore, they were expanding. So I came in with 100, others 50 in 1985 and 50 in 86, to fill those new stations, or to fill gaps that would be created by the opening of the new stations.
So when did you become the Dublin Fire Brigade historian?
I kind of drifted into that. I'm not sure that I was ever officially told there was a historian anywhere, but I drifted into it. One of the things, I always liked history. I was always very fond of history, and I had a great interest in Irish history. And when I joined the job, a couple of things struck me. That a lot of the guys, I was in my 20s in 85, working with fellas who were coming up to retirement age. They'd come in the 1950s. They had stories of a whole different brigade, a whole different city. But in their young days, they'd work with guys who'd fought the fires from the Rising and the Civil War. And the fellas who'd been to Belfast and the rest of it. And in some cases, there were the sons or relations of men who'd gone up. And the fact that I was in the job, like I was a firefighter out in Dolphin's Barn, I was involved with the union, I just became fascinated, always had a huge interest too in the whole revolutionary period. And the more I looked into it, the more I realised how much the two of them meshed together.
What was there before the Dublin Fire Brigade was established? What was the kind of defences in the city at that point?
Going back to the 1700s, there was an established fire brigade. Excuse me. But what the city did at that stage in the early 1700s was they bought a fire engine, but they privatised it. They gave it to a guy to run for them, and it was his job to employ firemen. Now, these weren't trained fellas. These were guys who might know how the engine worked, and they could be rounded up in the event of a fire. Very bad system. But in the start of the 18th century, by an Act of Parliament, each Church of Ireland parish And the vestries, the Church of Ireland vestries, basically ran the city at that stage. But each parish had to maintain a large and small fire engine. You can still see them down in on the St. Warburg's Church. The thing about that was the law said they had to maintain a large and small engine. Didn't say they had to work. Didn't say anybody within the parish had to know how to work them. They just had to own them. So some parishes were very diligent, trained people to use them, and were an asset in the area. Others were just there to meet the spirit of the law. Very bad system. A lot of big fires in the city because of it. Because you had basically untrained people with bad equipment. Because the equipment wasn't really updated. They were still using those early 18th century fire engines 100 years later. Insurance brigades began after the Great Fire of London in 1666. The whole idea of fire insurance came in. Moved out of London, started in London, moved out of there, and eventually moved to places like Dublin. And our first insurance fire brigade, the Royal Exchange, was founded in 1722. So you insured your house with them, you put a value on your house, agreed a value on your house, you paid a premium, and in return, if your house burned down, you got the value of it back. They put a mark on the outside of your house to show, a fire mark to show that it was insured. And they had their own trained firemen, each company. So if your house went on fire and you were insured with the Sun or the Royal Exchange or whoever, that's who you sent for. And they put your fire out. Then they began to deal with any insured property, and they'd sort out the cost between themselves afterwards. Then they began to deal with any fire, but with a preference always given to an insured property. So if the local orphanage goes on fire, they'll turn up to that. But if an insured house up the road goes on fire, they leave the orphanage and head off up there because they're the ones paying the bills. Again, not a great system, but it lasted in Dublin into the 1860s. Came to a head in 1860 with the Kildare Street Club fire. That was the home from home for a lot of the aristocracy and the British administration in Ireland. Went on fire. 5 of the workers there were killed. Loads of fire engines turned up. Insurance engines turned up. Parish engines turned up. All with different standards, different types of hose that couldn't connect one to the other. Nobody had ladders because life wasn't insured, so they weren't really pushed about saving life. It was saving property. So the brigade, or the city, decided in 1862 to set up a municipal brigade. And they were late to the game. Like Belfast had one over 20 years earlier. Edinburgh set up the first one in the UK 40 years earlier. So by the time they got around to doing it, it was an established thing in most cities in the UK and Ireland. Well, in the UK certainly. The Irish cities tended to follow Dublin.
The Great Liberties Whiskey Fire, I basically think it was more or less kind of forgotten for a while. How did you find out about it?
Well, I worked in that area. I worked in Dolphin's Barn, so that was all part of the area that we covered. I knew there was a story there. I always assumed it was blown out of all proportion and just an exaggeration that couldn't have happened, And then when Tom Geraghty wrote his book on the history of Dublin Fire Brigade, back around 2011, 2012, he covered it. And I know Tom well. And we spoke about it, and I began to research it myself, and I discovered it was the biggest fire in Dublin in the 19th century in terms of financial loss. It was the biggest one in terms of the area burned, and it was the biggest in terms of lost life. I also discovered why we don't know about it, because it suited nobody to tell the story. It didn't suit the city to have this story of the madness that went on at that fire, and the crowds gathering in to drink every drop of the whiskey that had burned in the warehouse that was flowing down the streets, that was being mixed with horse manure and anything else that the fire brigade could find that would soak it up and stop the flow and let the alcohol burn off. So they're building dams of horse manure, sludge from the tanneries, human waste from the tenements. But people are still gathering and drinking like what's pooling there as it cools down. So there's never even a final figure. We think 13 to 15 people. I found death certs for 5 of them. Actually, I found proof of death for 5, but one fellow has no death cert, another fellow has 2 death certs, which points to an awful lot of people dying of a similar thing in a short space of time. But it didn't suit the city to tell the story. It didn't suit Irish politicians who were starting to push the Home Rule agenda in the House of Commons to let this be. This is paddy whackery on a mad scale, It didn't suit the church, which was pushing temperance. And most of all, it didn't suit the whiskey industry, because the Irish whiskey industry was the premium whiskey of its day. sold throughout the British Empire and America and everywhere as premium whiskey. They didn't want this story of a warehouse full of the stuff goes on fire. And the people drinking it go mad and die and fall over and whatever, just bad images. So they basically killed the story very, very quickly. Within days, the whole story's changed, and it's, a terrible tragedy, very well behaved crowd. And, the police thanked them for all their assistance. There was 150 policemen there to try and keep control, and 300 soldiers were brought in to try and keep control. It was Paddy's Day on steroids. It was utter madness. A week later, the Lord Mayor, who was there, who saw what was happening on the night, had a fundraiser in the Mansion House for people who'd lost everything. And a lot of people did, because there were tenements, there were poor people, they had no insurance. And in raising money for them, he said they needed to raise money to give some bit of a footing to people to get started again who'd lost everything. And he said the great luck that they had with the fire was that nobody had been killed. And then, having said that, without drawing breath, he goes on to say that, and the people who were killed, nobody was killed, but the people who were killed, would have died in any city where people are fond of drink and had access to free drink. So it wasn't really a Dublin thing at all. That was, we can write them out of history. As I said, they weren't people of influence, they weren't people of property. They were the opposite, they were the men of no property. So they were very, very quickly written out of history.
The great man of the whole story, though, was Captain Ingram. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Ingram's a fascinating man. And I think he's one of a number of kind of unsung heroes that this city owes a debt to, and it's a debt which hasn't been paid yet in any way. The man lies in an unmarked grave in Mount Jerome, and a plaque to him, which was to go up during this year to mark the 150th anniversary, ran into problems, and it's temporarily in abeyance now. But how long the temporary is, I don't know. But I do have hopes that we'll get that up. He was an Irishman, a Dubliner, I believe. We know very little about him. Who emigrated to America in the 1850s and worked his trade. He was an engraver, a banknote engraver, and he worked for a bank in Manhattan. But while he was there, he joined the New York Fire Department, which was a volunteer department before the Civil War. And to be part of the fire department was a big social thing. And a lot of it came down to groups from different trade groups or professions or ethnic backgrounds, be it Irish or German or Italian or whatever, or old school Americans, Native Americans see themselves. A lot of infighting between them as well. Each one was like a separate fire department. The one he belonged to, interestingly enough, was very much part of the. Most of the members were Freemasons. In fact, all the members were Freemasons, and he was a member of the Masons. In 1862, Dublin put a note in the paper that they wished people to apply for the job of chief officer of the new brigade. Quite a number of people applied, some of whom went on to be quite significant people in the British fire service later, went on to be the chief officers of some fairly big British cities. Ingram, a fireman in New York, applied. He got his interview, he got his thing, he'd done some interview because he ended up as the chief officer and was chief officer for the first 20 years of the brigade. He built the brigade. 25 men in entirety. The establishment was for 40, but they never managed to recruit 40. Very hard work, very long hours, very little pay. So they never, up till the late 19th century, they'd ever come up to the full establishment of 40 men. So he fought that fire. He fought a fire on a scale that would have daunted London Fire Brigade with 25 men and 300 soldiers with shovels and a mounted a horse dog.
I just think the Liberties at that time would have been mostly built of wood.
There would have been old houses. There would have been unplanned houses. What the guy who owned the Malone, the fellow who owned the bonded warehouse, the law changed. There'd been an awful lot of small distillers in the country and in Dublin. But as whiskey was made, it was liable for tax. So you had no great incentive to make huge quantities. You just made what you could sell. But in 1823, the Excise Act changed that, and whiskey was only liable for tax when it was available for sale. So it could mature for 3 or 5 or 8 years, whatever they wanted. But then they needed somewhere to put it to do that, because otherwise you'd clog up each distillery with their own production. So this guy Malone came up with the idea that he bought the waste space at the back of the square formed by Cork Street, RD Street, Chambers Street and Ormond Street, and he built a massive bonded warehouse there. But all around of it, the shell are tenements, tanneries, stables, yards of holding animals. A lot of people there would have very small holders, might have owned 1 or 2 pigs. You'd get them from a butcher as young pigs. You'd rear them, you'd basically rear them by letting them loose on the streets, do whatever rubbish they could. And then when they came to a size, they'd be sold back to the butcher, and you'd either get a few bob or you'd get meat to supplement your own diet. So there was a lot, and plus everything, of course, is horse-drawn, so there's donkeys and there's horses around the place as well. So there was a lot of animals. That's part of the story of the fire, that people began to open the stables to let the horses out. Mander stables in Cork Street, very big commercial stables. The horses ran out. I don't know a whole lot about horses, but they don't strike me as overly intelligent, because had they gone that way, they were away from the fire. Had they gone that way, they were away from the fire. They went that way and ran into the fire. And so you had stampeding horses running through the place, pigs running through the place. And there's great illustrations from the time of people, running down the street, trying to drag a pig behind them, and with a couple of chickens under their rockster as they're going. It's the only bit of wealth they have, and they're trying to save it.
And like, wasn't there even things like where wakes, funerals? And things like that,
on Chambers Street, on the corner of Chambers Street and RD Street, there was a pub, and the owner of that pub hadn't been out of bed in, I think, 3 years. He was shifted out of bed that night. The customers, his wife rounded up the customers, and they carried him out of the place and away off up the street, because what was happening was, when the warehouse went on fire, it's been fed by the barrels of whiskey, 250,000 litres of whiskey in the place that we know of. So you had a burn and flood. You had the worst of both things. You had this wave of alcohol boarding as it went. So it didn't come to the door and burn through the door and then set fire to the house. It flowed under the door and started a fire inside. So he was helped out. Up in Chambers Street, there was a wake in the house. And again, like that, all of a sudden, the house just burst into flames. The whiskey starts to seep in under the door and burn. So the people there gathered the corpse and headed off up the road with him to get him safe away. Having said that, from witnesses, they got him a safe distance and propped him in a doorway, and then went back, because people started to realise that there's free whiskey. Now, of course, it's not whiskey. It's stuff that was made yesterday. It's in all stages of maturity. It's stuff that you couldn't drink at the best of times until it's fully matured, and it's being mixed constantly by manure being thrown on the streets to soak it up and to block up the drains. So it was a fairly unholy cocktail.
Captain Ingram himself was a maverick. Was there a story that he ended up like having a boat blown up in Dublin port, or is am I mixing up people?
No, he did. Well, it was in Dunleary, or Kingstown as it would have been at the time. A boat called the Nagport was on fire in Dunleary Harbour, and it was drifting into the inner harbour with the tide. And among the mixed cargo was the ingredients for gunpowder. So Dunleary, Kingstown had no fire brigade. So they sent to the city for Captain Ingram to come out with his 25 men. So that wasn't allowed. So Ingram came out with 1 or 2 to see what could be done. And everybody there is catastrophizing, saying this is going to come into the inner harbour. It's going to blow up. It'll send burning pieces everywhere. It'll burn all the other ships. It'll burn the warehouses, burn the town down. So he had himself rowed out, had a look, and he said, yep, that ship is gone. Like, there's no saving this. So his solution was there was a Royal Naval base there as well. So we sent for the Royal Navy to show up with a gunboat and put a couple of rounds into the boat, into the Nagport, under the waterline. So as soon as the boat was holed, it sank in the inner harbour. Fire went out, tide went out, so they could salvage the goods that were on it and get the ship sorted out and refloated it away. So yeah, he did. He had a great capacity to think outside the box. There's a huge debt owed to him. He was the founder, the father of Dublin FIre Brigade. Now, I'd argue that a later Chief Plunkett was probably the father of the Irish Fire Service and was the one who brought Dublin FIre Brigade really forward. But I think Ingram has been forgotten, and it's a pity that he has, and it's a shame that he has,
Yeah,
And
'cause,
he
like, he's
he
a
should be
Dublin
remembered.
hero, like, you
Oh,
know.
absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. There was himself and Charles Cameron, who was Sir Charles Cameron was the health officer, the public health officer for Dublin City for something like 50 years. And funny enough, another prominent Freemason. But he made huge steps forward in sanitary arrangements in Dublin tenements, in health campaigns. Excuse me. One of the last things he did was actually inspect Frongok after the 1916 Rising on behalf of the corporation and put in a report criticising the conditions in the camp for the prisoners. Yeah, they're two forgotten men. They're men who I'm sure would have known each other through their association to the Freemasons. They would have known each other, and plus as civic officials, they would have known each other. But I think they're both kind of equally forgotten and both equally deserve recognition.
Yeah, because like both of those, well, the whiskey fire and that incident down in Dunleary were complete disasters.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely, yeah. Oh, really? Well, yeah, both had the potential. Like, had the whiskey fire not been stopped, the streets in that area, and I've often walked those streets, there's a downward kind of turn on the streets towards St. Patrick's Cathedral. So, like, had the fire not been stopped where it was, there's no saying where it would have ended up. You know, it was literally flowing freely through the street, burning. It was like lava. It was just flowing freely through the streets, burning.
people thinking that the cathedral was defended by the winds or something like that.
Well, in Ormond Street, the fire at one stage threatened the convent there, the Carmelite convent. It's still there. I don't think it's a Carmelite convent anymore. I think it's a care home now. But it's one of the few buildings in the area that survived the fire and that has kind of age to it. And on the night the fire in Ormond Street was rolling towards it, and there was a change in the wind, and that blew the fire back across the road and saved the convent. And the Irish newspapers at the time were very, very, they thought this was the an act of God, God's will saved the convent. Now it blew it back into our old tenement houses. So as I have to say, the people at the tenement houses might have taken a more sour view of God's will.
Yeah.
But anyway.
How did Captain Ingram end up in life? What was his story at the end?
He died young. He was 38 when he took over Dublin FIre Brigade, and he was 58 when he died. He died from tuberculosis, and TB was the biggest killer of Dublin firemen in the 19th century, because they lived in very poor conditions. They worked among the tenements in a city where TB was endemic, and so they were very, very prone to it. And like I said, it was the single biggest killer of firemen at the time. He died at 58. When he died, his wife, of course, had to move out of the fire station because she was no longer the chief's wife. And I found her on a couple of subsequent census returns, but she never remarried. And another daughter, the two surviving daughters, one died later. So I think the Ingram name pretty well died out. There were some relations, and I would love to make contact with them, because I know one relation, Ingram wasn't the surname, but it was the name he adopted. Went to America and became a film director, Rex Ingram. Oh, yeah. He made a famous film called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, a silent era film. But he apparently took Ingram as a stage name because he did have a relationship with the family. Like I said, I'd love to know if there's any Ingrams out there, if there's anyone that has a relationship to that family.
He definitely deserves to be commemorated. Like,
absolutely.
The same way that Bang Bang got commemorated because of that kind of campaign by the cafe and everything like that. I think something like that should be done for Captain Ingram.
In fairness to DCC, in fairness to the libraries in particular and the commemorations committee, they've been very, very good. I've been working with them now for a number of years to get plaques up at places where firemen lost their lives in the city. And they originally requested 4 plaques. With a 5th then for Ingram, who didn't die at a fire. He didn't die in the line of duty. He died as a result of work, but not because of work. But I think his status as the Force Chief deserves a plaque. But so far we've had a plaque at Westmoreland Street to remember 2 men who were killed there in 1892. Another on Trinity Street to remember John Kite, killed in 1881, the first fireman to lose his life. We've one on Townsend Street at the old married quarters to remember Jack Darman, who was killed there in an accident while working in the station in 1938. It's a line of duty death. And the last one, and hopefully next October, which will be the 90th anniversary, to remember the 3 men killed in Pearse Street, in the Pearse Street disaster in 1936. There is a small plaque there that was put up by Tom Geraghty and others, but we hope to replace it with the standard corporation plaque, which is polished marble with a red stripe at the bottom.
When did the Fire Brigade first unionise? They were one of the first organisations to do that, weren't they?
The world's first dedicated firefighters union was the DFBU, the Dublin FIre Brigade Men's Union, in 1892. Up to then, firemen, if they joined the union, you could join the Municipal Employees Union, and you were in the same union as the bin men and any other corporation worker. But there was a strong tradition of trade unionism there, because a lot of firemen came in from trades, and the Dublin trade union movement was very influenced by the Fenians. There was a lot of Fenians had gone into that era, so there was a sort of crossover there from the trade union movement, from tradesmen coming in, stonemasons, carpenters, various people who had a background in trade unionism. And through that background in trade unionism in Dublin in those years, you would have also been in contact with the Fenian movement. The first secretary of the DFBU he wasn't a fireman. He was an outsider, Richardson, who was on the Supreme Council of the IRB at the time. He represented the firemen's issues. But yeah, the DFBU was the world's first firefighters union. That was actually recognised back in 2018 by the British Fire Brigades Union, who were celebrating their 100th anniversary. And as a result of what they knew about the DFBU and some work I'd done, they invited me to be part of that, and I worked with them through that year, fantastic year, on commemorations in Northern Ireland and across the UK. And it was a lovely recognition. Unfortunately, there's very little recognition here from our own unions. But again, sometimes there's only so far you can push any stone up a hill.
Yeah. Now, I'd say that being unionised might have caused the Fire Brigade problems with people like William Martin Murphy and all of that during the 1913 lockout. Because I'd say that they heavily mistrusted people from the Dublin Fire Brigade.
The Dublin Fire Brigade in the lockout is kind of an interesting one, because they weren't involved. The lockout involved the general workers union, the transport in general, the casual workers. The actual trades and the like of the DFBU weren't involved, but as trade unionists, they were very much involved in fundraising, and their sympathies would have been very much with the strikers. A combination of their trade union activities and possibly Fenian links had led to a kind of discord between themselves and the DMP. The DMP never really liked the Dublin Fire Brigade, and the Dublin Fire Brigade never really liked the DMP. The DMP, Nelligan, in his biography of his time in the DMP, said that they never really got on with the firemen. They were a surly lot, and they were militant and unfriendly to the police. Like, they made no secret of where their sympathies lay. But on the other hand, the chief officer at the time, Purcell, in his annual report from 1913, he lists a lot of fires that happened in the city as a result of the lockout. And in particular, there was a kind of parallel strike going on with farm labourers. And in parts of North County and South County, it led to a lot of fires, hay fires, so forth. That was part of the to and fro of it. And he lists a lot of the hay fires that the Dublin Fire Brigade attended to. And he just has, underneath in his own handwritten report for it, he just has a line underneath, and he says, Larkinism. So yeah, he wouldn't have had a huge amount of sympathy for the idea of a trade union, but the trade union was there, and that was it. And the city council, there would have been a lot of people there from the trade union, so it wasn't something he could completely ignore. He had to come to terms with them.
During the 1916 Rising, what kind of activities were the Fire Brigade up to at that point?
The Rising, a fascinating thing. It was one of the things that I was always really fascinated with, because Dublin Fire Brigade were the only organisation that actually existed in 1916 that still exists. Other than the British Army, I suppose. But in 1966, they were very much written out of the story. And in 2015, I was given the job of working on heritage projects. And I spent my last 2 years in the job working on that. And part of the brief was to basically tell our story. And it's a fascinating story. On the 24th of April 1916, nobody in the fire brigade, with one exception, nobody in the fire brigade would have known that this was planned. No more than most people in the city. One man, Joe Connolly, was a member of the Citizen Army. All his family were members of the Citizen Army. But he'd seen the notice in the paper the previous day, cancelling the rising. So he was on duty in Tara Street. And in the morning, his brother Sean was moving a Citizen Army unit to take over City Hall and attack Dublin Castle. And on the way, he crossed Butt Bridge and stopped at Tara Street Fire Station and told Joe that the rising was gone ahead. So Joe left the station. He reported to the GPO, and on the way to the GPO, Joe was a driver, which was an unusual kind of skill to have in the Citizen Army. Citizen Army, again, tended to be sort of general workers. Driving would have been a skilled job, but Joe was a driver. On the way, Joe hijacked a car, which I believe to be the first political carjacking in Irish history. Hijacked the car at Butt Bridge, took it to Liberty Hall and used it to ferry supplies to the various garrisons. And then he ended up on the College of Surgeons garrison and fought there through the week. At the end of the week, he surrendered with the garrison. He ended up in Frongok. But when he returned from Frongok, he just reported back to Dublin FIre Brigade and was accepted back. The political winds had changed. And Joe also was aware of a bylaw that came in 1914 to encourage firemen and corporation workers generally to join the British forces. And it said that if you did join the military, your job would be kept open for you. You'd be continued on half pay. Now, that was a huge incentive, especially for the lower paid corporation workers, labourers, because they get their army pay, plus they get half pay from the corpo. And it wouldn't be considered a break in service. Your time in the military would count towards your corporation pension. So Joe came back and he said, my military was the Citizen Army. So got his job back. He continued, his service was unbroken. And he actually pursued and got his back pay for the period from the 24th of April till he returned to the job that he'd been on active service, just with a different army. For the rest of the brigade, the whole thing came as a surprise. There's great reports of them turning out into O'Connell Street on day one, and they're dealing with things like the Lancers to ambush there. They're starting to deal with the small fires, and even they're fascinating because the first two shops looted and burned, and looting and burning always goes together. Yeah, you know, it's one of those horse and carriage, love and marriage, looting and burning. Two shoe shops. But like Dublin's poor had the run of the city. They could go anywhere. The police are off the streets. It's a revolution. Anything can happen. They didn't go to the banks. They didn't go to the jewellers. They went to the jewellers later. They went to shoe shops. That was the luxury that they wanted. Was pairs of shoes. That's what they looted. They burned the buildings after them. It's strange. It's a strange mob mentality, but you see it everywhere, that when people loot, they tend to burn, whether it's to try and cover up the crime that they've committed or whether it's just another act of kind of nearly anarchy, you know, to show that the rules are overturned. But they were the fires that are spotting around the city on the first day, and the brigade are able to deal with them. By Tuesday, the British declare martial law, and the brigade are off the streets. They can only respond when the military tell them they can respond. Part of the reason for that is by Wednesday morning, the British have faced entrenched rebels in the South Dublin Union and taken heavy casualties. On the Wednesday, the Sherwood Foresters are being slaughtered at Mount Street Bridge from entrenched rebel positions. So it sort of suits the British to let these fires, which are starting to spread through the city, spread, because in a way it's burning rebels out of positions that they'd have to assault otherwise. Part of the fault, if you like, for the rapid spread of the fires was down to a volunteer tactic of mouse holing. When they took a building, rather than, if they needed to move to the next building, they'd knock a hole in the wall rather than expose themselves in the streets. So you'd work your way through a whole row of buildings and you'd knock holes at various floors, various angles, so you couldn't set up here and fire 5 houses down. But it also meant that literally the firewalls were breached. So as the fire spread through the buildings, this allowed rapid flame spread through it. So you see, if you look at the fires, if you look at the aftermath of the rising, the whole squares, whole city blocks are burnt. It's not individual fires, it's entire city blocks. The fire brigade could really only get to work on the 29th after the surrender. But within 24 hours, they'd stopped the fires in the city centre. Now, they actually got assistance from two brigades that the chief regarded as, well-trained brigades, and that was the Guinness Brewery Fire Brigade and the Powers Whiskey Distillery Fire Brigade. And funnily enough, there was a long-running acrimony between the city brigade and the township brigades, so he didn't bring in the Rathmines fellas, and he didn't bring in the Pembroke Fire Brigade. The kind of unwritten rule was that they could not cross the canal into the city, but the fire brigade, the Dublin Fire Brigade, would cross the canal to deal with their fires. But it would be considered a shameful and embarrassment to have a fire so bad in the city that you call the Rathmines Fire Brigade to deal with it.
I think it's great. A lot of people think that the British basically set most of the fires in the city through incendiary devices, but they didn't even exist.
There was no such thing at the time. That's an old canard, and it's been quoted in so many books, and people give great eyewitness accounts of these incendiary shells. There were no incendiary shells in 1916 for 18-pounders. It was the sheer volume of fire set fire to some buildings. If you fire a machine gun, if you fire a Lewis gun or a Vickers, on extended fire into any building, it'll set fire to something. It'll find, be it soft furnishings or rupture gas pipes or whatever. But basically, it was the fires that were being started as a result of military action, all right, but being spreading by virtue of the tactics of the time. The volunteer side, the mouse holing, and on the British side, the fact that they were quite happy to see the fire spread. As I say, it was burning volunteers out of prepared positions and putting them back on the streets where they could attack them more easily.
Ostensibly, the DFB were neutral, but that was almost an impossible kind of thing during the War of Independence. But given the fact that most of the people were supportive of the Republican movement, how did the DFB assist? And I mean, there's myriad answers to this. I'd say probably.
Well, I tell you, there's a sea change in 1917, because in 1917, Captain Purcell, who'd been the chief officer since 1892, retired due to injury. He was thrown from a moving vehicle. It was real Wild West stuff. He was gone up Grafton Street in a buggy, the chief's buggy, and it hadn't been properly connected. The horses hadn't been properly connected, and the horses actually broke away from the buggy, and he was dragged from the buggy because he had the reins in his hand, and dragged up the street for a distance, and the horses were stopped. So he was quite badly injured. Although, having said that, he lived to a good old age afterwards, a very productive life. But he decided it was time to step aside, and he was replaced by his lieutenant, as they were called in those days. The chief was called the captain, and the next in line was the lieutenant. And that was a man called John Myers, whose father had been an officer in Dublin Fire Brigade. Myers seems to have had great sympathies for the Republican movement, and you see it time after time. One of the things, early 1920, there's a fire in Rathmines, in the big church there opposite Calgary Barracks, and again, it was a fire on a scale that the Rathmines Brigade couldn't deal with, so they asked for Dublin Fire Brigade to come in. When Dublin came in and were dealing with the fire, Myers was approached by an officer of the volunteers, who explained that the sacristan in the church was also the local quartermaster, and that they stored weapons and ammunition in the vaults of the church, and it would be a huge embarrassment. A huge loss if they were found, but also a huge embarrassment, and a great propaganda victory for the British had this been shown. So Myers arranged to pull the Rathmines men out, put them working outside, and he sent Dublin firemen in to get the guns and ammunition and pass them along to the volunteers to get rid of them out the back, and made sure that there was no trace of them found. And there's no mention of it in the official report, which is a legal document. There's no mention of that. But in one of the witness statements for the BMH made by a local officer, he said that, Myers was considered to be very sympathetic and very strong on the national question, I think is the way he put it. Myers also recruited men who he knew to be active Republicans, including 1916 veterans, men who served time after 1916. You find a number of men coming in 1920 when the shift system changed and the job expanded to take account of that. You find people who've served prison sentences for IRA offences. In the past, anybody applying to the job would have had to have an excellent character and would have had to have references from the local DMP or RAC station to say that they had no criminal record. He was taking in men who were coming, who'd served time in Mountjoy, who'd served time in other prisons, who'd been in Fronguk. Men who were active volunteers and remained active volunteers while in the job. Plus, again, I've done a lot of work on these guys. I would have worked with the sons and grandsons of a lot of these men. You find that the general feeling is that the job there was a large number of men on what they call the active list, both Citizen Army and IRA. But you also find that the rest of them are being counted as active sympathisers, not actually sworn members, but active people who will help. And what they're helping is they're able to operate outside of curfew. They're able to go about the city and see who's moving around, who else is operating outside of curfew, who's moving houses, where are people coming and going at various times of the night. They can move men and equipment. If stuff is needed in place for an ambush, the stuff can be moved there and left by ambulance or whatever. And the people who are going to take part in the ambush can simply travel on the tram or whatever there, get their weapons, carry it out, dump the weapons, and they're collected again and taken to a safe house. So you get a lot of that sort of thing. Where it really comes to a head, there are a number of burnings of tax offices through 1917, 1918, 1919, and even into 20. They're always assisted. They're always, the entire contents are lost on every occasion. But where you really come to a head is the Custom House, which is the head. Like the castle is the head of British military and police administration, British security administration. The Custom House is equally important because it's the head of British civil administration. This is where they raise their money in Ireland. This is where the taxes are paid through. So you have the local government board are there, and the revenue are there. So the IRA want a prestige hit in Dublin. The war has been portrayed in the international press by virtue of the British feeding the international press the story that this is vandalism. This is small scale agrarian stuff. This is lads down in Tipperary hiding behind the wall and shooting the policemen, and it's small scale. We'll deal with this. So what they want to do is make it a war, bring it to the streets of Dublin. In more recent wars with Iraq or whatever, what they would have called, the green area, the secure area in the heart of the city. And on the face of it, that should have been a totally secure area in the heart of the city. It's the biggest civil administration building. The IRA arranged to take it over. They go in at lunchtime. They clear the staff out. They spread paraffin because they've thought to the firemen. If you want to burn a big stone building, it's no easy undertaking. So you need people who understand how buildings burn. So they're saying, listen, paraffin. Never mind petrol. Don't use petrol. People aren't familiar with petrol in those days. They don't have cars. They have paraffin heaters and paraffin lamps. They understand how paraffin burns and how slowly and at what sort of temperatures. IRA men have been killed by petrol. I came across references to it in some statements as, Boscan Sogert, the death without the priest, when they've gone into RAC stations or abandoned RAC stations, they're going around slashing petrol everywhere. And then somebody decides to have a fag or light up a cigarette or, strike a match to set fire to this. The whole place goes up because it's full of vapours. They warned them about that in the Custom House, that it was used paraffin. So they actually hijacked a paraffin truck and got tins, and the guys got in, were carrying those. They spread that fire to the building. They were spotted, the auxiliaries arrived, there's a gun battle starts. Some of the staff and customers who would have been in the building are coming out, IRA men are coming out with them, they dump their guns and come out with them as if they were just innocent bystanders caught up in the whole thing. The IRA have taken over the fire stations to make sure that there's no quick turnout. Now, the easiest takeover in the world, mostly they're dealing with their own people. in Tara Street. They took over at the station. And when the auxiliaries finally came to see what was happening as they're coming in the back gate, the IRA K Company, the 3rd Battalion, are being driven out the front gate in the ambulance and dropped a safe distance away. Then they respond to the custom house. This Pathé newsreel of them responding. And there's a great photograph actually used in the book. There's a great photograph of one of the horse-drawn ladders arriving at the front of the custom house, the side away from the river, if you like, the side facing what's the opposite. And you can see heavy smoke in one small area. But that's all. The rest of the building isn't touched yet. What the firemen do when they arrive is they take massive lengths of time to make down to the height. There's water on 2 sides. There's a river and there's a basin. And then there's a ring of hydrants. So they take record-breaking lengths of time to actually get some water out of this. And then if you look at the Pathé newsreel, they're washing the sidewalk and they're washing the pavement and they're washing the walls. Very little water got into the windows. But what the firemen are doing inside is more interesting because they're going in with axes and sledgehammers. That's the tools of firemen's job, wouldn't you? And they're using them to break into parts of the building that the IRA didn't have access to. And they're taking the unused paraffin and spreading the fire through it. So one of the guys, Michael Rogers, talks about how, I think his exact quote is something like, the building was at our mercy, and within minutes, portions that hadn't been affected were blazing nicely. So the firemen keep that fire going. The custom house burns for 5 days. O'Connell Street, the centre city, is brought under control 24 hours after the rising. The custom house on the Liffey, with a large water basin where the IFSC is now, and a ring of hydrants, burns for 5 days. And eventually they were ordered out with the British military because they felt that they were being that were under pressure not to put the fire out from the IRA. They didn't realise they were the IRA.
What's the difference between how petrol and paraffin burns?
Petrol would be much more. It's the vapour petrol is the really dangerous. That's the really flammable thing there. And people, as I said, people weren't really used to petrol. People didn't have cars. Cars were a relatively new thing on the roads. Very few people would understand the car, would understand the internal combustion engine. Drivers or people who worked in garages might, but even they were still sort of learning a lot about it. What had happened in places around the country was the IRA had seized petrol, which was being supplied to the British military and the RAC for their vehicles. They'd seized them from train stations and so forth and used them in arson attacks, but discovered very, very quickly how dangerous it was. People understood paraffin. They'd been handing paraffin and they'd paraffin heaters and paraffin lamps, and they understood the flammability and the kind of range of flammability, what you could do with paraffin and what you couldn't do around it. They didn't understand how dangerous petrol was in the same situation. That the fumes of the petrol, the vapours of the petrol, were really what was dangerous. Even, it sounds silly, but more so than the liquid. If you had a sealed thing of jar of petrol and you put a match into it, it'll just come out. But once it has vapours built up, they'll flash over straight away. So they had, as I say, you had that thing of, they were very wary of it, the Boscon Soggart. But again, it's one of the 19th century shells in 1916. Most sources you read on the custom house will tell you how they went in with their cans of petrol and burned the place down. They didn't. Because if they had, they would have blown up the custom house and probably half the Dublin Brigade with it. There was another fire shortly after the custom house, and it's a very significant fire, and it's a fire that people don't take into account. And again, maybe I'm looking at it from a fireman's point of view, but I'm also looking at it from somebody who was an interest in the War of Independence. There was a huge fire at Parkgate Street at what was the National Shell Factory during the First World War. And it was literally a shell factory where they made ammunition, artillery ammunition. The buildings are still there. They're derelict now. We believe they're all going to be redeveloped into a multi-storey, whatever. But at the time, the British were using it. The artillery shell manufacturer had gone with the end of the war, but it was still British military property. And the British transport section, the REME, I think the Royal Engineers Mechanical Engineer, or Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, were using it to store vehicles. Now, these were both vehicles coming in from the docks that were going to be allocated to units around the country. But there were also, and again, a very significant thing people forget, we always think of the big ambushes. But if you look, an awful lot of units are spending an awful lot of time digging trenches and roads and felling trees. And if you're looking at that and saying, what is that apart from a nuisance value? If you put a Crosley tender down a road and it's loaded up with 20 troops and they hit a trench, it's going to damage the axle or it's going to break the suspension. And that vehicle is now off the road. And it has to be returned to Dublin and it has to be returned to the workshops and reworked. And while it's gone, you're down a lorry. That's raids you're not carrying out. That's patrols you're not carrying out. You're tightening, you're losing mobility by the loss of the trucks. So what the IRA decided to do was there was 50 vehicles in that premises. Now those were new vehicles waiting to be allocated to units. There were vehicles that were in from units to be repaired and returned. There were 5 peerless armoured cars in there. At no point during the War of Independence, at one point where they took over the armoured car at the abattoir to try and get McKeown out of Mountjoy, that was the only time they ever actually captured an armoured car. And that was because the crew were outside having a smoke. They never took one in action. You couldn't. I mean, it's a mobile fort. They burned 5 of them there. They had 2 men, 3rd Battalion guys, who were working in there as carpenters. And they said a very simple, as they were leaving one night, said a very, very simple incendiary device. And I made the terrible mistake many years ago at a talk of explaining exactly how the incendiary device was constructed and how it would work. And I'm never doing that again, because people come up to me afterwards and say, I've got to try that. That sounds like, I want to try that and see if it works. So firemen probably shouldn't be telling people how to make incendiary devices. But they set it, went off about 3 o'clock in the morning, set fire to the carpenter's shed, set fire to the building, set fire to the yard. The Dublin FIre Brigade arrive and do precisely nothing. They preserve the petrol stores on the site because they know what will happen if that heat hits the petrol. So they concentrate, taking the water from the Liffey, they just cool down the petrol. They had 50 trucks and 5 armoured cars born. It's a huge blow to British mobility. This is early June. And all of a sudden they have taken out the summer campaign. It's when they should be on the roads morning, noon and night. 50 vehicles are now gone. That can't be supplying a barracks in Mayo. That can't be raiding suspects' houses in West Cork. That can't be transporting troops around Tipperary or Galway. It's a huge blow to their thing. And it's not that they can just send, a car ferry over to bring back another 50, because they go on the end of the queue. The British military is looking for stuff for India. It's looking for stuff for Afghanistan at that stage. They're looking for stuff in India. Ireland isn't necessarily going to be the top of the queue. So their mobility nationwide is badly damaged by that. It's a hugely significant attack, but it's not an attack where a shot is fired. There's no whiff of gunpowder here at all. Nobody fires a shot. Somebody lights 2 candles on the way out of work one night. And this massive blow was struck to the British military. So, and shortly afterwards, people will argue about the Custom House, that it was a terrible, that it cost the Dublin Brigade of the IRA so many men and so many helps. It cost the 2nd Battalion very heavily. And the 2nd Battalion, not to dismiss them, they were probably the most active battalion in the city. Every battalion was in action that morning, covering off various areas, be it the fire stations or whatever else. The casualties and the losses and the arrests were in the 2nd Battalion. The other 3 city battalions were still at full strength and still operating, and operating immediately to show the British that they were still in the game. So the Custom House tends to be looked at through the prism of the Civil War. And if you took one side, if you're of one view on the Civil War, you say, oh, it was a disaster. Sure, that was the last of the ammunition and the weapons were captured there. Sure, we'd no option but to go into talks. We'd no option but to sign, to accept the truce and accept the treaty then from it.
Neil Jordan's movie.
Neil Jordan's view of Irish history, yeah.
Yeah.
Jordan's view of Irish history. The other one is to say that, listen, no, it actually, if anything, it strengthened, it showed the British that this could happen in the centre of one of their most secure areas. What will happen next? And then you followed on with the destruction of the thing. One of the things about the loss of weapons, I've been able to trace, I reckon around 40 weapons that were taken out by firemen, because firemen are going into the building, they have free range of the building, and they're finding the handguns, and they're bringing them out under the uniforms, and they've been stashed in the fire engines. They're brought back to Tara Street, they're cleaned, and the following night they're brought to a dump on the Malahide Road, owned by a guy called O'Neill, who was the OC of the Citizen Army in Dublin at the time. and they ran a lot of the logistics for the IRA. So, you know, there's 3 firemen the following night bring weapons. Well, actually, one was there's an army guy in a fire brigade uniform who'd been smuggled into the custom house to inspect the damage and to supervise the removal of the guns. So, like 14 of those guns, and these were the fellas picking up these guns are active volunteers. The 1916 men. No, they're not picking the rubbish up. They're picking up they're picking up the Lugers, they're picking up the Parabellums, they're picking up the Colts, they're picking up the ones they want back outside. There are photographs of Auxies with captured weapons, and a lot of weapons were captured, but not quite maybe as many as people like to think. The other thing about that night, the first night of the custom house attack, Michael Rogers writes about it, and I always find it fascinating. The whole place is blazing. The Auxies have taken over Liberty Hall as a base to work out of. And while they raiding Liberty Hall was a hobby for the auxiliaries. They couldn't just smash the place up on a regular basis. But they found the instruments for the transport band and they seized them. But as the night went on, the Auxies, doing a check of the area, discovered there were bonded warehouses further away from the custom house and decided they better check those just in case. And a lot of cases of whiskey and brandy were loaded on trucks and sent back to Beggar's Bush, but a lot were kept on site. And they also raided some local pubs. There were barrels of Guinness on the quayside for export, so they got taps from some of the local pubs and glasses and started tapping into them. So the Auxies were having a fair old party. And apparently in the middle of it, they set up fellas who knew how to play, got some of the instruments and set up and began playing on the steps of Liberty Hall. And Michael Rogers remembers the firemen looking in amazement as the Auxies started to play Keep the Home Fires Burning. Now, the bit, as he said, that was great fun because they were also maybe generous enough to share a few of the pints and a few of the bottles with the firemen. But the other thing was that apparently a row broke out with the Auxies over who was the best shot. And they settled it by drawing out the revolvers and shooting out any windows that were left in the custom house. So he said like that, what was he said there, that went beyond the realms of entertainment. That was the way he put it. But yeah, the fire brigade then go into the truce period. And the funny thing about the truce period is the talks are being held in the Mansion House. Huge crowds are gathering. Everybody is there. IRA intelligence people want to see who's gone in on the British side and see who's moving around the British side. British intelligence want to see the same. Neither side will accept the other to police it. The Republicans won't accept the DMP or British military to police this. The British won't accept the Republican police on the streets, overtly policing. So the decision is made that they'll use, and again, it shows the level of British intelligence regarding what was going on in the Dublin Fire Brigade, the lack of intelligence. They decided that the Dublin Fire Brigade could be used to police this because they were a uniform municipal body, acceptable to everybody. So what harm would the firemen do? So there's great photographs of firemen in uniform, some of whom are identifiable as IRA men, Jim Conway and others, minding the crowds at the custom house. They go into the truce period. At the end of that, in the December, when the treaty is signed and it starts to move towards civil war, nobody believes that's going to happen until it does happen. And when it happens, 5 firemen leave the brigade. I tend to use the term fireman. Some people find that slightly offensive because nowadays it's firefighter. My justification is that I was a firefighter for 32 years, so I'll call it what I like. And the other thing is that I deal in a period when that was the proper terminology. And rather than trying to twist the terminology to suit today's view, but I would, I apologise if anyone takes offence from it. And firefighter there were firefighters, but the rank was firemen. 5 firemen left the brigade to fight on the Republican side. Nobody on the Free State side, but 5 left to fight on the Republican side. Joe Connolly rejoined his comrades in the Citizen Army. He was very quickly ordered back in by Oscar Traynor to the fire brigade to work undercover. And undercover, using the ambulances, they were going in and out of Republican garrisons, including the forecourts, carrying messages and supplies, and also bringing out people who were needed, dressing them as wounded, and then bringing them out. Others went and fought with the units.
Was that
true? As the battle moved on from Dublin, then they just simply faded back into the fire brigade.
Was it true that you thought the De Valera might have been basically put into one of those?
We know people were removed from the block at the end by fire brigade ambulances. De Valera, I don't think he ever spoke directly about it, but certainly in biographies I've read, he was removed by a Red Cross ambulance. Now the thing is, there was Red Cross vehicles, but it was also the common name for first aiders in those days as Red Cross men, and any ambulance was a Red Cross van or a Red Cross ambulance, you know. So it's both specific organisation, but it's also a general term that's used to describe anything. I've never seen a fireman claim that they removed him. One guy, Tom Smart, with Bridie Klein, I hope I've got the name right, Francesca O'Reilly's mother. She was brought by fire brigade ambulance dressed as a nurse into the forecourts to carry messages in and out. She was also brought up to Blessington to speak with the Republican forces there, to carry messages to and from the city with the Republican forces who were going to move in from Blessington to lift the siege of the forecourts before the forecourts fell. How they done that is beyond me, because a Dublin Corporation ambulance should only be operating basically within the canals, within the city. The idea that it would be in the country, and the only explanation I can find, and it's based on kind of experience of the job and the way it could possibly work. There used to be a thing called a CNP, a cert no pay, where an ambulance could be privately hired by a doctor. If he had a patient that he felt needed to go to hospital, the fire brigade ambulance were only supposed to deal with accidents. If you were knocked down on the street outside, they took you to hospital. If you fell ill in your house, they didn't. It was the doctor's job to arrange it. But a doctor could hire a DFB ambulance to do that. So my assumption is that they had paperwork to say that they were working on a private run for a doctor to bring them to Blessington, because it meant that they could get through Free State lines, they could get through Free State checkpoints unchecked.